There have been some presentations made by the apologists for fracking in New York in particular that I wanted to address. Some untruths that need to be debunked and some misrepresentations that need to be debunked. These are six of the kind of the most popular misrepresentations. One of them is that the shale is so far down that it will never get up into the groundwater. That's not true. Number two is they talk about how well the well is built, which is missing a big part of the whole picture. They talk about how great it is for the economy. Well, that's more spotty, and particularly in New York, it's a lot spottier than you might imagine. They talk about how this has been done for 80 years and stuff, and there's no problems in it. Well, actually, it hasn't been done for 80 years. It's been done for about 10. And what has worked okay in Texas with problems could be a real mess up in New York. They talk about how the towns will benefit, and we'll talk about what might really happen. And then the one that really gets me is they say, well, New York has too many taxes and too many regulations. Well, the fact of the matter is, when it comes to the fracking shale, it doesn't have any regulations. It doesn't have any taxes. Sort of big misrepresentation number one is they talk about how deep it is, like that's some kind of firewall to the groundwater. First of all, it's not even those intervening layers are not a guarantee to keep fracking fluid, methane, out of the groundwater. In New York in particular, there's vertical faults that pathways that would get methane and fracking fluid from around the shale formation if the frac goes, particularly if the frac goes out of the formation up into groundwaters, up into aquifers. Hazen and Sawyer did a study on this for New York City, and it shows exactly how that could happen. It is in fact a relatively low probability. So what they're doing is they're making a big deal out of a relatively low probability to take your focus off of what are the much higher probabilities of pollution. And that is that all this stuff, the chemicals, the frac flow, about everything, sooner or later it's going to be on the surface. It's either going to start on the surface or going to come back on the surface. And that's how it gets into the groundwater. And that's how it gets into people's wells in New York. The way the deception or the misrepresentation works is they'll show a bunch of slides about all the stratigraphic layers, all the sedimentary layers between the Marcellus or the Utica and the surface, and they'll even go through them all. And the point is that so what? So what? There's all these layers in between. The fact is from a probability standpoint, all the pollutions, all the problems are up on the surface. So the fact that they can recite the sedimentary layers between the Cambrian and the surface is like, it may dazzle some people, but it's just totally irrelevant. This all started, so far as I can tell, when an Halliburton executive wrote a paper that was widely published and subsequently has been splattered all over the internet that addressed the depth between the Barnett Shale in Texas and the typical aquifers, and also the depth between the Marcellus Shale and the typical aquifers in Pennsylvania and New York. And again, it's focusing on a relatively low probability problem. The problem is that, and in that regard, there's nothing erroneous about it. The problem is that people take this stuff to these meetings and stuff, and they'll come in there and they'll say, well, my well is at 150 feet and the shale is a mile down there, and so, what do I have to worry about? Other than being stupid, they've got a lot to worry about. You'll see this pop up from that original Halliburton article, which was only about a year ago. You'll see it come up in presentations. You'll see it circulated by fracking apologists. Some people, it really becomes the core of their presentation. Englander, Siegel, what's that guy's name? They'll make Scott Klein. They'll make a big deal out of this, about how much they know about pressure gradients and all this other stuff. It's largely irrelevant. It can happen, but what it is a shell game to take your mind, to take your focus off the big problems and the big picture, and frankly, the real problems. The fact is that most problems are at the surface. Out of the fines that have been meted out in Pennsylvania, about 1,500 of them have been predominantly for surface spills. The industrialization is inherently a surface problem. It goes on in the surface. The frac trucks run on the surface. They don't, run through the Devonian formation. And the problem, of course, in New York in particular, is that rural water wells are particularly vulnerable to surface pollution because they're just tapping groundwater. They're tapping a water table that's 50 or 150 feet below the surface. So there is, of course, one big exception to that, and that's a frac waste disposal well. If you put too much of this stuff into one of those and it leaks, and then you really have got problems. This shows the difference between getting water out of a water table that's very shallow into groundwater, to the left of the slide, and getting water that's actually very deep, and a lot deeper than it's shown in this slide, from 800 to 1,000 feet, like it would be out west in Colorado, Wyoming, Texas, out of an aquifer, water that's been down there literally thousands of years in some cases. Those shallow water wells near the surface is where you have problems. That's where you've got vulnerability. That is not the case in West Texas, in New Mexico, in Colorado. That's why you haven't seen these problems show up. They haven't cropped up. They are starting to crop up in Pennsylvania. Could be a showstopper in New York. Some of this surface pollution obviously will get into streams, it'll get into creeks, it'll get into lakes. In Texas, there are no natural lakes. There's only one, Caddo, in East Texas. All the other lakes are owned by municipalities. They control those lakes. They can, in many cases, they control the shoreline. They control the mineral rights under the lakes. Not the case in New York. Every one of those lakes, except for the New York City reservoir, and we'll talk about that in a second, they're all owned by the state. The state can lease them, can lease under them, can lease next to them. It can trash that water, and the people that drink out of those lakes, nothing they can do about it. Oh, this is another one that really gets me. These apologists and the camp followers and whatnot, they'll go into just great detail about how the well is drilled. And mind you, it is a tough well to drill. You got to know what you're doing, to drill. It takes a lot of training. Don't want to downplay that. God bless the guys who know how to do this right. But so they show you all this stuff about how they set the surface casing, all this other stuff. Lots of pretty pictures. All the crews in like starched uniforms, clean. Everybody's all cleaned up. Of course, it never happens like that. Wells get completed in the middle of the night, in rainstorms at 2 in the morning, whatnot. What they don't tell you about these wells and how well they're done is that they all rot, they all rust, they all corrode. Sooner or later, particularly if they're not properly plugged and abandoned, those well bores are all going to collapse, every one of them. It's just a matter of how soon they do, and when they do, that surface casing, all that other stuff, goes to rust, and whatever's in that well bore is going to end up in somebody's aquifer. It'll end up in somebody's well if it's not done correctly. The reason why a lot of them end up like that is because the original operator, the one that's doing all the pretty pictures and stuff, will end up selling that well, and it'll end up being sold a couple of 3 or 4 times before some guy ends up with it and just walk away from it. There are thousands of wells in New York State even, which is not a big drilling place, that have been abandoned. They're orphaned. The DEC has no money to plug them. Somebody walked away from them is probably the 3rd or 4th operator in the chain in their life cycle. They're rusting. The water's all the way up to the water table, to the groundwater. The well bores, the collapse, corrode, methane channels from the outside of the casing, hydrocarbons, benzene, whatever is in the formation, anything that's lighter than water, any oil is going to rise to the top of the column. It is a perfect vector for getting pollution from down in those formations, from in that shale, up into somebody's groundwater. And the DEC's got no money to fix these wells. Not the ones that they've got now. Millions of dollars worth of plugging liabilities, and certainly not the ones that they're going to have. The reason why this is a particular problem with these shale wells is because of their decline curves. I mean, 75% of it's gone in the first year, and in 3 or 4, 5 years, it's all the fun's over. That means that those wells are going to get sold to basically less and less reputable operators 2 or 3 times until it ends up into some funky shell corporation, and then it'll go on the railroad commission, or the DEC is like shut in, and then they'll just collapse the corporation and they'll just walk away, and they won't get plugged, and they'll just sit there and rust. And like I say, in one of these horizontal shale wells, that could happen in 10 years. I mean, easy, where they're just orphaned and they're out there rusting, and they're perfect vectors for pollution into somebody's well water. There's a lot of orphan wells in New Mexico and Texas, but frankly, out in the Yatesville in New Mexico, what it rains maybe 6 inches in a year, or in the Permian Basin, or even the western part of the Fort Worth Basin. It's like, so what? The groundwater, there aren't any groundwater wells, so it's not like it's getting into somebody's well water. There's so little rainfall that the rate of rust is probably not that great. The quote unquote water table may be 1,000 feet below the ground. That, of course, none of those environmental factors pertain to New York. I mean, New York is like a textbook environment, a perfect place to rust out an oil well or a gas well. It's, it even has the brine formations that would accelerate that. Great place for ferrous metal to rust. The other one, of course, and probably maybe the most common, is that everybody's going to get rich in New York on this stuff, and sadly, I wish that was true, but it's just not the case. The population density and such is different than it is in Texas. There's no tax on this gas in New York, so the state won't get a nickel. The out-of-state producers, like particularly ones that are, say, domiciled in Texas, where there is no state income tax, they're not going to declare any income tax in Texas. They may talk like Forrest Gump, but they're not stupid. The property values on a lot of homeowners, particularly near a frac truck route, are going to go down in New York. And the really phenomena about this, particularly because of these decline curves on these shale wells, is these local tax assessors. Every township in New York has its own little tax assessor. They're not even going to be able to figure out how to value the damn things. I mean, they won't even end up on the ad valorem property tax rolls. So Harry Levine sent me the guidelines on assessing the property valuation ad valorem tax on wells in New York, and it's at least 50 years out of date. It bears no resemblance to how you would assess the value of a shale well, because the decline curve is so steep. So if a tax assessor from a little township went out there before the well produced, well, it's worth so much because it's got some hardware left on it, and so he'd get that wrong, and then he goes out there a year later, and 75% of the value is gone. So, it's not out of the question that they would literally miss, say, 85% of the value of the well, even if they were on their toes, even if they knew how to value these things, even if the New York State Revenue Service guidelines were up to snuff, which they're not. These local taxes, that means the school district, the county, the townships, they're not even going to get any ad valorem tax off these things because, A, they don't know how to value them, B, they're not on their toes, and C, the value will be gone before the guy gets out there to take a look at it.